The lights had been out for 9 hours when Commander Alara Vasquez decided she wasn't going to die worrying about it. She was in the deepest bunker of Launch Station Kiral 7, 400 meters beneath the frozen crust of Proxima Centauri B's northern continent, and the countdown was still running. She knew this because she could hear it. Not in any electronic sense. The boards were dark, the comms dead, every redundant power relay as cold as the ice above her. She could hear it in her bones. In the hum the station made, when its mechanical systems still spun on momentum alone, like a top that hadn't been told to stop. The launch window was in 11 hours. The window was 11 hours. That was fixed. That was a physical fact. The orbital mechanics of this system did not care about the power grid. She found the flask under the tactical console. She'd put it there herself 3 months ago, on the day she'd arrived at Kiral 7, and understood immediately what kind of posting this was. The kind where you kept a flask somewhere sensible. She took a sip and waited. The Veth had cut the power at 03 Judge Local. She knew it was them because the severance was too clean. Not a surge, not a cascade failure. Just gone. Everything at once, the whole geothermal grid, which was the kind of simultaneous cut that required either a catastrophic natural event or a species that had been watching them long enough to understand their infrastructure. The Veth had been watching them for 11 years. They were very patient, very thorough, and they had made, Vasquez thought, a very specific miscalculation. They believed humans needed the lights to think. The interview had started as a formality, which was typical of Isaac bureaucracy. The Interstellar Assessment Commission had insisted on a pre-launch compliance verification, conducted via the secure comm line from the orbital relay. Vasquez had agreed because it had seemed harmless. The compliance officer's name was Rennick, younger man, very earnest, with the clipped speech of someone who had spent his career filing forms and had developed a vague, anxious quality whenever the forms stopped working. The comms had gone out at 0304. The emergency backup had flickered on at 0311. A 7-minute gap, and then Rennick's voice, much thinner than before, because the emergency backup ran at a fraction of normal bandwidth, and also because Rennick sounded like a man who had just confirmed that he was, in fact, alone on his orbital relay platform, with no way to call for help except through this single attenuated channel to a woman 400 meters underground. "Commander Vasquez," he said. "Still here," she said. The primary grid appears to be down, yes, and the launch is still 11 hours. There was a silence. She could hear him breathing, processing, filing something internally that didn't fit any of his forms. "Doesn't that?" he started. "Rennick," she said. "Are you calling to verify compliance, or are you calling because you're scared?" Another silence. Shorter this time. "Both," he admitted. "Good," she said. "Then we'll talk. I've got vodka." "Well, not vodka. It's actually a fermented grain thing the hydroponics bay produces that we've taken to calling vodka, because the alternative is calling it what Kepner makes in the back corner when she thinks nobody's watching. But it serves the same function." She heard something that might have been a very small, very reluctant laugh. "Tell me about the Veth attack vector," she said. "From your end. What did the relay sensors pick up before the cut?" "That's Commander. That's classified. Rennick. I'm 400 meters underground with a non-functional power grid. No way to call fleet command, and a live launch asset sitting on the pad. I am the most classified thing currently in this system." "Tell me," he told her. The Veth were not, despite what the popular press had decided early in the contact period, evil. Vasquez had read every xenobiological assessment produced in 11 years of hostile encounter, and the consensus was consistent. The Veth were not operating from malice. They were operating from philosophy. They believed, insofar as a hive-distributed intelligence could be said to believe anything, that spaceflight was an expression of incompleteness. A species that needed to leave its origin world was a species that had failed to find sufficiency where it stood. The Veth had found their own sufficiency 500,000 years ago. They had not moved since. Their homeworld was old and dense and silent in the way of things that have stopped trying to become something else. They were, by any definition, finished, and they had decided, with the calm certainty of the genuinely ancient, that any species still reaching outward was a species in the process of making a mistake. They weren't trying to destroy humanity. They were trying to help. This was, Vasquez had always thought, the most terrifying thing about them, because it meant there was no anger to appeal to, no pride to wound, no fear to exploit. The Veth did not experience the engagement as a conflict. They experienced it as a correction. every mission they shut down, every colony ship they turned back, every launch window they sabotaged. These were, to them, acts of kindness, patient, exhaustive, millennium-spanning kindness. They intended to continue until humanity understood what the Veth understood, that the universe was better left alone by those who had not earned the right to move through it. Vasquez poured a second measure into the cap of the flask and looked up at the dark ceiling of the bunker. She thought about the probe sitting on the pad above her. The Sonder 3. 15 years of design and construction, 7 of them under active Veth interference. 43 personnel who had worked on the project and never seen its completion, transferred or reassigned, or in 3 cases killed in accidents that had been categorized as accidents because the alternative required a policy response that no government wanted to authorize. The probe carried a package of instruments designed to take a detailed census of the Proxima System's outer bodies, plus a secondary package that the mission brief described as communications infrastructure deployment, and which was, more precisely, a relay network that would allow the next wave of colony ships to navigate the outer belt without depending on the Kiral 7 station's guidance systems. In other words, if the Sonder 3 launched, humanity stayed, the colony would stop being precarious. It would become permanent. The Veth knew this. Of course they knew this. They had been watching for 11 years, and they had cut the power. The sensor sweep before the cut, Rennick was saying, his voice steadier now. She noticed that he steadied when he was reporting rather than speculating. Showed a distributed field effect. Same signature as the Callisto incident. It's not a physical weapon. It's something they can project. Like they reach into the system's electrical logic and just tell it to stop. Like turning off a light switch, Vasquez said. Yes. Can they do it again? If they could do it once, Rennick, can they do it again while we're trying to restore power? That's a different question. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear keystrokes. He was actually running numbers, she realized. He was better at this than his initial panic had suggested. The field effect takes time to build, he said. The Callisto records show an accumulation phase of about 6 to 8 hours before deployment. They'd have to start another cycle from scratch. Which means if we get the power back in the next 3 hours, they can't cut it again before the window opens. She did the math in her head. Power restoration plus launch prep plus the window itself. Tight. Very tight. What's drawing the most load in the current system architecture? The guidance array. It's the most power-hungry. We don't need the guidance array. Silence. Commander, without the guidance array, the launch trajectory won't be. The launch trajectory is already locked. Has been for 3 weeks. The array was doing real-time refinement, yes. We lose some precision in the outer belt navigation. How much does that affect mission success probability? More keystrokes. Longer this time. She took another sip and waited. Guidance array offline reduces outer belt navigation precision by about 12%, he said finally. Success probability for the primary relay deployment drops from 91 to 79%. 79%, she said. What does success probability drop to if we don't launch? A long, long silence. 0, he said. Then we don't need the guidance array, she said. What else can we drop? They worked through it like that in the dark for 2 hours. Her and the compliance officer. She'd learned by the end of the first hour that he'd spent 3 years as a systems engineer before moving into administration, which explained why he could run the numbers and why he'd been placed on the orbital relay in the first place. The administration track had been, she suspected, a mistake he'd made early and hadn't yet figured out how to unmake. The Veth had designed their attack for a version of the mission that required every system to be functional. The attack assumed that humans deprived of their infrastructure would stand down, that they would observe the darkness, calculate the impossibility, and choose not to proceed. What the Veth had not modeled was the possibility that a human commander would simply decide to do it wrong. Not wrong in a careless sense. Wrong in the sense that she was willing to discard every system that wasn't absolutely necessary, strip the mission to its skeleton, and fly the skeleton. The Sonder 3 had been built with redundancies, overlapping systems, backup arrays, secondary protocols. It had been built this way because the engineers who designed it had been afraid. They had tried to engineer out every possible failure mode, which meant they had put in far more than was needed for any single trajectory on any single day. What Vasquez was doing in the dark, drinking something that was not quite vodka, was figuring out which parts of that engineering she could throw away. The answer, it turned out, was most of it. Tertiary thermal management, she said. Non-essential at current atmospheric temperature. Navigation beacon. We know where it's going. Secondary data recorder. Primary sufficient. Communications array 2 and 3. Do we need 2 and 3? The relay network it's deploying will become the communications array once it's operational, she said. We only need the probe to communicate with us long enough to confirm deployment. One array handles that. Silence. Then, you're basically flying a very expensive rock. I'm flying a very expensive rock with a very specific thing in its belly, she said. Everything else is packaging. She heard him exhale. It was the sound of someone recalibrating. If we're cutting tertiary thermal, secondary data, nav beacon, comms 2 and 3, and the guidance array, he said slowly, the power draw drops by 63%. And what does 63% load reduction do to restoration timeline? It means more keystrokes, fast now. She could hear him getting ahead of himself. It means the geothermal auxiliary could restore to minimum operational threshold in approximately 90 minutes. If the VETH field is still dissipating from the initial deployment, which it is, according to your accumulation phase estimate, then yes, we could have enough power for a stripped-down launch sequence in 90 minutes, which gives us roughly 8 hours before the window. More than enough. Vasquez looked at the dark ceiling again. She thought about a word she'd heard once at a conference, years ago, a biologist talking about how life occupied every available niche, how the organism that couldn't survive the optimal conditions would simply develop a different strategy, how what looked like adversity from the outside was, from the organism's perspective, just conditions, just what was there. Start the geothermal auxiliary restart sequence, she said. Walk me through the procedures from your end. I'll handle the physical relays down here. Commander, he said, and there was something different in his voice now. I'm a compliance officer. No, she said. You were a systems engineer who had a crisis of confidence and took a desk job. Tonight we're fixing that. A very long pause. How did you? Your restart calculations took 11 seconds. A compliance officer would have taken 45. Start talking. She had worked in the dark before. Not metaphorically, literally. Her first posting out of the academy had been a deep subsurface survey station on Europa before the VETH contact, back when the biggest problem humanity faced in space was its own limited engineering. The Europa station had lost primary power 3 times in her first year there. The second time, it had stayed out for 19 hours. She had been a junior tech, then 24 years old, running cable through crawl spaces while her senior officers managed the emergency protocols. And what she remembered most from that night was not the fear which she had felt, but the strange satisfaction of the physical work. The weight of the tool in her hand, the specific resistance of a connector that needed reseating, the way competence felt like a location, a place you could stand in while everything else was uncertain. She found the relay junction for the geothermal auxiliary in the 3rd maintenance corridor, behind a panel that required a tool she didn't have. She found a workaround. Then she found the connection between the auxiliary and the stripped-down launch systems, and found that it had been severed, not by the VETH attack, but by the original installation, because nobody had anticipated needing to run a launch sequence off geothermal auxiliary power. She found a workaround for that, too. Rennick talked her through most of it. She corrected him twice. By the 3rd correction, he stopped apologizing and just adjusted. Why are you still here? She asked at one point. She was lying on her back in a crawl space, threading cable by touch, and the question came out with the casual directness of a person who had no social energy to spare. What do you mean? On the relay. Why are you still at Curl 7? You requested a transfer 8 months ago. I saw your file. A pause. You read my file? I read everyone's file. Why are you still here? The transfer was denied. There were some irregularities in my last compliance assessment. I was told I needed another full review cycle. What kind of irregularities? Another pause. Longer. I filed a report, he said, about the Callisto incident. I concluded that the mission parameters at the time didn't account for VETH interference patterns, and that the shutdown wasn't a systems failure, but a targeted attack. My supervisor said I was overreaching. They were wrong, she said. I know, he said, but they were my supervisors. She found the end of the cable run. She felt for the junction housing. She seated the connector by feeling for the click. Rennick, she said, after tonight, I'm going to recommend you for the mission evaluation team for the next phase. If we get a next phase, he started. I'm not doing it because you've been helpful, although you have been. I'm doing it because you were right about Callisto, and they punished you for it, and that's not how this is supposed to work." She heard the click. "Try the auxiliary startup now." A pause. Then, over the comm, a deep mechanical groan from somewhere above her, and then a hum, building, and then the faint orange glow of emergency lighting bleeding into the crawl space from the junction above her head. "We have power," Rennick said. She lay there for a moment in the faint light, listening to the hum, and felt something settle in her chest. Not relief, exactly, something older. The feeling of having been right about something that mattered. The launch prep took 4 hours instead of 8, because without most of the systems, there was simply less to prepare. She and 2 technicians who had sheltered in a secondary hab, she hadn't known they were there until the lights came back, and they walked into the main bay, sheepish, carrying a thermos of something genuinely hot, moved through the abbreviated checklist with the efficient exhaustion of people who had stopped being frightened a while ago and were now simply working. The technicians were named Oha and Ferris. Oha had been trying to sleep when the power went out and had spent the 9 hours thereafter reading a physical book by flashlight which she found in her kit bag. Ferris had been running through launch simulations on a personal tablet until the battery died at hour 4, after which he had, by his own account, sat in the dark and thought about his mother's garden. He said this without embarrassment, which Vasquez found she liked. "What was in the garden?" she asked. "Pears mostly," he said. She had a way with pears. The Sonder 3 looked different on the stripped-down checklist, smaller, more honest. Without all the redundant systems, the pad display showed a vehicle that was, by mass, about 62% of what it had been designed to be, which meant it was lighter, which meant the fuel ratios were actually better than optimal, which was the kind of accidental improvement that happened when you threw away the weight you'd added to protect yourself from every possible failure. She thought about the Veth. She thought about their philosophy, their patient, enormous kindness. She thought about what it would look like from their perspective. The power gone, the base silent, and then nothing. Humans standing down. Humans recognizing their incompleteness and retreating to it. She thought about how this must be what they expected. She stood at the console in the faint orange emergency lighting surrounded by the hum of the geothermal auxiliary, and she thought, this is not a tragedy, this is not a loss. What is happening right now is that a species that has spent 500,000 years learning to stay still is about to discover that a species which has spent 500,000 years learning to move cannot be taught to stop. Not by cutting the power, not by removing every non-essential system, not by leaving one woman alone in the dark with a flask. She might have been built incomplete. She might be a species still in the process of becoming. But she was going to be incomplete in the outer belt of Proxima Centauri, and then in the belt beyond that, and then further. That was the thing about incompleteness. It kept you moving. "Launch in T-minus 20 minutes, she said. "Copy," said Rennick. His voice was different now. She couldn't quite name the difference. He sounded like a man who had reminded himself of something. "The ISAC compliance assessment," she said. "I assume we're still in that process technically." "Technically, yes." "What's the conclusion going to be?" she heard him think. "I think the conclusion is going to be that Commander Vasquez of Kiral 7 executed the Sonder 3 launch under adverse conditions with a modified mission profile and achieved primary mission objectives through adaptive resource management." And a pause. "Unauthorized systems reconfiguration." "ALD," she said. "That's the technical classification. What's the outcome classification?" He stopped, started again. "There isn't a box for this," he said. "Make a new box," she said. Oha called the 10-minute mark from across the bay. Ferris was running through the final abbreviated checklist with the same focused attention he'd probably brought to thinking about his mother's pears, which was to say, completely. There was an energy in the bunker now that hadn't been there before, the particular electricity of people who knew that something was about to happen and had done the work to make it possible. "Rennick," she said. "Commander." "When we're done here," she said, "I'd like you to write up the Callisto report. The real one, no hedging." A pause. "That report was rejected. File it again. Under my name if you want. I'll sign it." A longer pause. She checked the countdown, 8 minutes. "Why does it matter?" he said. "It already happened." "Because the next one is going to happen too," she said. "And the one after that. And if we keep calling their attack systems failures, We keep treating them as systems problems, and we keep trying to solve them by adding more systems. And then they cut the power, and we have too much infrastructure to fly without it. She looked at the launch display. The Sonder 3, lean and stripped and ready. We've been building for optimal conditions. We should have been building for this. For no power. For whatever they do next, she said, which we won't predict, but we'll find a way through. We always find a way through. I don't know if you'd call it a law exactly, but it's something consistent about us. We don't stay stopped. She could hear his breathing, even. Thoughtful. T-minus 5 minutes, Oha announced. Vasquez stood at the console. She picked up the flask and took a last sip and set it down on the console top, where it stood in the orange light like a small monument to the principle that certain things should be kept somewhere sensible. I'll file the report, Rennick said. Good, Commander, for what it's worth. I don't think they expected this. No, she agreed. The Veth, they modeled everything else. They modeled the infrastructure, the power load, the orbital window. But they didn't. He searched for the word. They didn't model someone deciding that the infrastructure was optional. Humans are bad at deciding things are optional, she said. Usually, it takes a specific kind of pressure. She was looking at the countdown. 2 minutes. I think that's what they got wrong, she said. They've been watching us for 11 years, and they saw us adding systems. Backup after backup, redundancy after redundancy. They saw us building a machine that required everything to work in order to function, and they decided the machine was us. She paused. The machine isn't us. The machine is what we built because we were afraid. When you take away what we built because we were afraid, what's left is T-minus 60 seconds, Oha said. Vasquez picked up the checklist. 23 items. She had memorized it 2 hours ago. She ran through it at something very close to normal voice and in the tone of someone reviewing something that was already decided. Item 1. Item 2. Item 3. Down through the list in the orange light, in the bunker 400 meters under the frozen crust of an alien world, with 2 technicians she barely knew and a compliance officer speaking to her through 40 kilometers of thin air. While above them, the stripped and honest frame of the Sonder 3 sat on its pad waiting to do one specific thing. Item 23. She closed the checklist. Launch, she said. The sound reached them 6 seconds later. Not the full roar they would have gotten through the monitoring systems with all the arrays operational. Just the raw physical thing, the actual noise of combustion and thrust, muffled through 400 meters of rock, and then through the bunker walls, and then through the air to her eardrums. It was a big sound, bigger somehow than she had expected. It had the quality of something that was not asking permission. Ferris made a sound that was not quite a word. Oha laughed. It was a short laugh, a single exhalation, but it was real. Vasquez watched the telemetry on the stripped-down display. Altitude, velocity, trajectory. Numbers moving in the direction numbers were supposed to move. Rennick, she said. I'm watching from the relay, he said. I can't see it on the visual feed. It's a pause. It's very bright. Everything going up is very bright, she said. Yes. Another pause. It's still going. It's going to keep going. The telemetry numbers climbed. The trajectory held. The stripped-down guidance system, navigating without its array refinements, with 12% less precision in the outer belt, held the line that had been locked in 3 weeks ago and needed no correction because it had been right to begin with. At 47 seconds, the Sonder 3 cleared the atmosphere. At 61 seconds, Rennick said, Ephethlian insertion nominal, in the tone of a man who was reading numbers off a screen and also doing something else entirely. At 6 minutes and 40 seconds, the first relay node deployed. At 9 minutes and 8 seconds, the second. At 11 minutes and 52 seconds, the third and final node deployed, and the relay network came online. And somewhere in the deep math of orbital mechanics, the passage to the outer belt became less a hope and more a road. Vasquez set the flask back under the tactical console for next time. She sat on the edge of the console and looked at the display for a while. The numbers were stable now. The Sonder 3 was moving away from her at a speed that made the concept of speed feel small. It would keep moving. There was nothing left to stop it. She thought about the Veth, their ancient patience, their enormous incompleteness that looked like completion, their 500,000 years of learning to stay still. She felt no anger toward them. She didn't think she would, not even later. They had done what made sense to them. They had applied what they understood. It wasn't their fault that what they understood was not, in the end, the whole of it. The whole of it was harder to model than a power grid. 3 days later, when the geothermal primary was restored and the base was operating at full capacity, and Vasquez was working through the most extraordinary backlog of administrative reports she had ever seen, a message arrived from the Veth signal band. It came through the relay network, through the Sonder 3's deployed nodes, the ones that had not been there before the blackout, the ones that now stitched this system into the next like a hand reaching across water. The message was not hostile. The Veth did not do hostile. The message was, as best the translation systems could render it, something in the register of, a reconsideration is in progress. Vasquez read it twice. Then she filed it in the project log, under a heading she created for the purpose. Evidence that they are learning. She thought about what she'd said to Rennick about the Veth's mistake, about modeling the machine instead of the thing inside the machine. She hoped, in the particular way of someone who was genuinely uncertain, but genuinely hopeful, that the reconsideration would eventually reach the right conclusion. That one day the Veth, in their ancient endless distributed patience, would add a new item to their model, something they hadn't had a category for before. The item would say, "These ones don't stop. Not because they are fearless, not because they are powerful, not because their technology is superior, or their numbers are greater, or their civilization is older. Because when you cut the power and leave them alone in the dark, they find each other through the static, and they figure out what they can throw away, and then they throw it away, and then they fly. They keep flying." The lights in the bunker were on. The corridor smelled like recycled air and something fermented that wasn't quite vodka. Oha was somewhere in the Hab section, probably reading. Ferris had sent her a photograph from a message packet to his family. A pear tree in a small garden, lit by late afternoon light, heavy with fruit. She had put it on her desk. She got back to work.